from my office in UCC. What I want to talk about tonight is the emphasis in Cork City Library was on ordinary people's experiences in history, and so I wanted to talk about the work that I had done looking at how ordinary people negotiated, particularly charity, in the early years of the Free State. And so that's what I'm going to present to you this evening, and I'll show you a few of the sources that I've used. I suppose to start off in context, I think a hope of a new social dawn faded fairly quickly after independence in 1922 for those who were already living in poverty, as that poverty merely deepened and worsened, both as a result of the conflict, but also as a result of the post-conflict world. Thousands of people were forced to negotiate a living, quite literally, from various sources. Due to the paucity of state assistance, most people in need depended on convincing charities of their worthiness, and an awful lot of energy went into this. And it's really extraordinary to me how much time it took up for the people in need to really make their case, and on a regular basis. I'm seeing if this one, the slideshow actually isn't, oh, there it is, moving forward to me if I click on screen. The picture there in front of you is a picture of Archbishop Byrne, and this is one of the devotional cards that would have been given out. But in this case, if you can see there at the bottom, it's written, "I am 83 now, my dear friend." And I think this reflects very well the main source material that I'm going to draw on this evening, which are thousands of letters written to Archbishop Byrne, who was the Archbishop of Dublin between 1921 and 1940, and was well known for his, as he would say himself, love of the poor. And certainly the people of Ireland approached him in that way. He was also Archbishop during a very interesting period, in the sense he was there for those first two crucial decades of independence, going into up to 1940, which allows us to sort of track those early years as the state and the church kind of combine their forces to build this new state. The majority of those who wrote to the Archbishop were the parents of families, and they used these letters as vital negotiating spaces within which to elicit some form of help from their church. Their letters amount, I think, to a good deal more than a litany of woes and requests. Embedded in many of them, explicit in others, and less so in many, is a social critique of the universe that they inhabited, and a real savviness and awareness of the way in which the world worked around them. These writers were aware that poverty was contested, and that much energy was expended by those in control of the resources in proving people, whether or not people were responsible for their own poverty. And so those that wrote to the Archbishop are very much, they start the correspondence very much on the back foot, aware that they have to prove, if you like, that they really are in need. And in this climate, I think each writer had to confront the likelihood of not being believed. And for many, the defense against this assumption was to try to enhance their moral position by asserting their faith, for example, or stressing the centrality of their motherhood or fatherhood, and insisting upon their innocence and their church's responsibility for their welfare. In effect, I argue that this required the construction of a narrative that explained the self and need as part of a drama of honourable survival, which required even the barely literate, and some of these people really are struggling with the page and still do an incredibly good job of expressing their case. It required them to engage with the tropes and expectations and the limitations of their society and its priorities. And I'm interested, I suppose, in analysing these letters as scripts of poverty in which the poor sought to construct their own identities in a world that so often projected values and failings onto them. So it's a kind of a unique space for them in turn to take some control of that narrative. In particular, I want to explore the role of gender in the charity dynamic, both as a tool of negotiation, and I'll explain what I mean about that in the course of the paper, and as a basis for expectation and judgment. So the different ways in which men and women engaged with the experience of negotiating charity, but also the different expectations and judgments made of men and women are become very, very obvious when you read it, when you engage with a source like this. So when you have thousands and thousands of letters and you can really divine sort of patterns over time. I don't think it's any surprise to say, because not much has changed, that those at the greatest risk of poverty were widows with children, mothers with large families and absent or unemployed fathers, children, single elderly women, and widows without children, and single mothers. While it was generally accepted that people were more susceptible to poverty at certain vulnerable phases of the life cycle, this too was highly gendered. Women were more exposed to pregnancy, childbirth, while caring for young children in widowhood and old age. So they were much more vulnerable to the stresses of the life cycle, much more likely to be exposed during those moments. The idea that poverty's greatest conquests were women and children was universally accepted by contemporaries and has been reiterated by a wide range of international scholarship on the history of poverty. And as I say, in contemporary society now, people would talk about the feminization of poverty, but in fact, it has a very old history. However, poverty also had a predominantly male face because of the roles assigned the genders in family life. Men were the breadwinners, but women were often the scavengers for a family in extremis. So by that, I mean they were expected to move in and take control when the family was in dire straits. In May 1932, for example, Elizabeth G. wrote a short appeal to the Archbishop to evoking her home full of unemployed, starving men. I've just given you a sample there. One of the things you might notice when you see the sources on the screen is how beautiful the handwriting is of almost all of those who wrote during this period. Even if their spelling wasn't great, their handwriting was generally excellent. I earnestly appeal to your honour to know, could you help me out of a little trouble? I owe 3 weeks' rent and I'm threatened with eviction. There are 3 of my sons and husband idle, and we are living practically in starvation. Trusting the above will receive your kind consideration. The oral historian of Dublin tenements, Kevin Kearns, has pointed out, by custom, mammies were the designated mediators and problem solvers. Husbands expected them to settle matters of every sort. Acting as the family's safety net required having to negotiate with this and sometimes boldly confront values and authorities. And I would certainly confirm Kevin Kearns' reading there. This interpretation of women's roles has recognized their agencies. So Kevin Kearns recognizes that however constricted the women had some agency in this experience. And others, like for example, Dorothy Porter, has referred to mothers as the main family agent in seeking relief for charity, because she argues it was an extension of managing the household economy. And certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that Irish women considered negotiating with charity as an extension of their role. However, while Mark Peel acknowledges women did and still do much of the hardest and most exacting work in the management of class inequalities, this was always an ambivalent and limited authority. And I think it's important to remember that. And you can, as I say, really see it in this source. The difficulty for the historian in accessing this agency and action, and in assessing its limits, because often there's little, if any, archival trail of this process of negotiation. The records of the various charities have helped to illuminate the criteria upon which charity operated and the limits of its remit, while oral histories further our understanding of how the burden of poverty has been historicized by its chief victims, and memoirs reflect how poverty has been inscribed and framed in life narratives. However, the documents generated by the recipients of charity are much harder to come by. Hence, the letters written by Irish people seeking charity, I think, provide a rare reflection of the experience of poverty in the early independence period. As Melanie Tebbott argues in her study of the history of working class credit, the mother invariably assumed responsibility for the family's troubles, being far superior to the husband in explaining facts. And I love that idea of women being far superior in explaining facts. And certainly that's the role that many of the women who write to the Archbishop take on to themselves. And they're very judicious about outlining the facts of the family as they are, both financially and in terms of the size of the family. Thus, a close analysis of how women explained poverty, I think, is a good starting point for trying to understand their agency. Poor women in Ireland had a plethora of charities to choose from, the majority of which were aligned with a particular faith and operated on the basis of religious loyalty. The idea of spiritually uplifting the poor was central to many of their raison d'etre. This was why they were there. It was central to what they were doing, if you like, the physical and the financial assistance was secondary. And I think we need to, really keep that at center stage when we try and understand how these people then negotiate with the charity. The act of seeking charity was, of course, never a neutral process, as people had to navigate complex social mores and religious sensibilities. And it should be borne in mind that the very act of supplication, quite apart from the realities of a life lived in poverty, exacted a toll on applicants. And I think that's something that really struck me very forcefully when reading memoirs and comparing the memoirs with the letters, was the sort of energy and effort and emotional a toll, if you like, that went into negotiating charity. The people who wrote seeking assistance from the Archbishop had to prove that they had exhausted all other options. There was little tolerance of working class sensibilities. One had to illustrate resourcefulness. So there was no point in being ashamed. One had to really list all the things that you had done in advance of coming to the Archbishop. To this end, the Archbishop insisted upon a priest's reference for each case to vouch for the author's Catholic credentials, in effect making the priest the arbiter of religious observance, because that's often what it boils down to. This system allows posterity to record to some degree which types of cases were most successful and what characteristics were most valued by the Catholic Church, but also to what degree there was a dynamic exchange between the laity and priests. And I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more in the questions if people are interested to know a little bit more about how that worked. For many of the people who wrote to the Archbishop for assistance, there was little need for elaboration. These were people well used to the dictates of charity. They knew to articulate their need clearly and succinctly. The poorer the writer, the more laconic the letter. The ingredients of the story varied little from unemployment and hunger. In 1927, Mrs. O.L.'s letter exemplified the classic misery script, if you like. My husband has been out of work for 9 months. I have 5 little children from 8 years to 4 months. The landlord is pressing me for rent, which I'm unable to pay. We have no fire and clothes and food, and we are sadly in need of all. Itemizing the number and age of children wasn't simply an exercise in head counting, and it's extraordinary how many times they do it. And often you'll have the ages actually written out 11, 10, 8, 9, 4 in the page. And it is really very striking when you read it. It was an act of iteration, I think, in which the purpose was to extenuate how each child was a life half lived because of poverty and a soul Catholicism needed to protect. For many of these women, constructing an identity as the mother of Catholic children was key to their entitlement. Woman after woman introduced herself as a Catholic mother with an unemployed husband, like this letter I have up on the screen here. I just put my cursor under it. I am a Catholic mother with an unemployed husband with 9 children, who for many years past, etc. You can read the rest there. Or they assured the Archbishop that his charity would relieve the much worried mind of a grief-stricken mother of many children. That is a quote from another letter. On one level, the message was that they wrote not for themselves, but for their children, while on another level, the implicit message was that these children needed to be helped in order to keep them in the faith, and that was not something that could be automatically assumed by the Church. Another vital ingredient was the establishment of character by underscoring that the very act of begging cost you in terms of dignity. In 1925, Mrs. Kay's letter offers a typical example of this form of strategic writing. I hope you'll pardon me taking the liberty of writing to you. I'm in this parish all my life. I am a young woman, married with 4 children, Your Grace, was also my confessor. Help me to pay a few debts and I will return it in masses. I am really ashamed to have to write this letter. She was a loyal, practicing Catholic mother whose poverty caused her shame and whose only currency were the masses she might offer in return for the protection of her church. However, as Thomas Sokol stresses when he's looked at the poverty letters in Britain, particularly in the 19th century, just because this form of plea was strategic doesn't mean it was not also truthful. Rather, these rhetorical elements should, I think, be regarded as integral to this form of communication. And I think it was understood to be that by the authors. And often I think they were taught this particular way to write these letters in school as well. It was the very nature of the supplication process that required these women to engage in this form of parlance, precisely because it allowed them to describe their situation in a way that located them firmly within the confines of their church's embrace by calling upon a common moral bond. And some of them did this much more explicitly than others. Now, my photography isn't great, so this letter is slightly out of focus, but I think you can still read it. Proving loyalty to one's church was a standard enough task. And to this end, women cited attendance at Mass, confirmed children, communions, and regular confessions. In other words, the various rites of Catholicism. In highlighting these events, these women underscored that they were engaged in the business of raising souls for Catholicism. Writing from Kiltiernan in County Dublin in September 1983, Mrs. Mary O'D framed her entire appeal around her religious fidelity. She was the widow of a man who had been, and I quote her, an exceptionally good Catholic and gave unstinted support to every church cause. And she was rearing 7 children and up to the present have been able to carry on and educate them. These 2 boys, I hope, will make good use of this opportunity for education and become good Catholic citizens. Mrs. O'D's first letter met with a simple no, annotated on the top left-hand corner. But she wrote a second letter that teetered on the boundary of conformity and protest, asking, I have always recognized that we owe a duty to both church and state. Is there no reciprocal duty? I think it's very interesting that she places church and state together in that way, and quite a few of them do. In fact, some don't make a difference between church and state. They'll say, you can send either priest or government to my house. So they will conflate the two as the same source. She concluded, I respectfully request you to have the matter reconsidered. 7 souls for God and 7 sturdy workers for Catholicity in Dublin City. Surely they are worth helping and will repay in kind. While many letters implied that duty and loyalty should work both ways, as in this case, few were as eloquent as Mrs. O'D. It is not clear whether it was this new approach or some other factor not recorded, but on this occasion, she secured the very significant sum of £20 to continue the education of her sons. And that was really a really huge amount of money. Most of the women who were writing, particularly from the very poor parts of either Dublin or rural Ireland, would not have got more than £1. And so to get £20 was really significant. Many of those who wrote to the Archbishop of Dublin couched their resistance in rhetorically strategic terms, either by asking for advice about better non-Catholic offers of assistance or hinting at desperation and the willingness of Protestant relatives to help out, or outlining how they could no longer fulfill their religious duties due to poverty. All of these claims may well have been true, and many cases were vouched for by at least one other witness. But they also undoubtedly represented examples of how people drew on the religious and moral universe they shared with the Archbishop to exact some amount of leverage in it. Mrs. Matilda F's short and simple request, written 2 days after giving birth, was entirely based on the need to be decent, to fulfill religious sacraments. I gave birth to a baby boy on Wednesday last, but now the difficulty is I want to get him christened, and I want to get something for myself to enable me to go to be churched. Whereas in 1934, Mrs. M.A. from County Sligo wrote because a failed harvest had left her family beggars. She concluded with an oblique criticism of the powers that be that allowed such poverty to persist, and a hint that there were other sources she could approach if Catholicism proved unforthcoming. I, as a poor Roman Catholic, make an appeal to your lordship for aid. The last year has left us beggars, our rent unpaid. What a sad state for poor, honest people, my gracious Lord. At the last minute, I'm seeking aid from Catholic sources, as I want to make up the rent and get a little for the children at Christmas. While Mary S. from Naas in County Kildare, describing herself as an expectant mother with 2 children, linked her poverty to their inability to be practicing Catholics. We're in dire distress for the last 6 months, and both I and my husband have been neglecting our Catholic duty for that time. The reason being we are both in rags, almost naked, of which I am ashamed. Now, mothers didn't just have the responsibility for producing future souls for the faith. They were also associated with transmitting religious values to their family. Hence, by drawing attention to the ways in which poverty hindered their ability to fulfill this key socializing function, they were engaging very effectively with the principal claims they had upon their church. As a convert to Catholicism, Mrs. Florence R. represented a considerable anxiety to the church, and she began her letter by highlighting the fact, "I'm a convert to the Catholic religion. My husband has been unemployed for the past 12 months. Both my husband and myself and my 4 little children are badly in need of bootwear and warm clothing. Trusting His grace may be able to assist me to obtain these. It's hard to see one's little children running around almost barefoot and shivering with cold. In fact, I have been sorely tempted to try to obtain these things from other sources, but have refrained from doing so with the strong intent to keep faithful to my religion." The threat is just sort of hovering there between the lines. She received £2 to help avert this temptation. Again, that was not an inconsiderable sum when compared to others. Within the limited confines of conformity, these women often held a moral mirror to their church, implicitly criticizing its inertia in relation to the real problems of its impoverished flock, asking repeatedly how they could be Catholic mothers without food, clothing, and heat. In many women's letters, this was a simple but effective narrative of their loyalty, juxtaposed with the society, implicitly also, I think, a church, that looked the other way when it came to their poverty. Others were more pointed in sketching this equation. In January 1939, Mrs. Agnes C. articulated the sense of being failed quite clearly when she explained, "We have often had to stop in bed 3 days a week to keep warm, and my children has to stay away from school. The priest gave me a bag of coal and some tea and sugar, bread. He told me to put my name down for the Vincent de Paul. I did so, but they never came near me. It's terrible that such things are allowed to happen in a Christian country. My husband is near out of his mind." The church was sensitive to the fact that such despair could lead to the abandonment of faith. This theme regularly surfaced in the reports of the Vincent de Paul, for example, and it's clear they were really very concerned about it. For example, a paper read at its general meeting in 1918 noted, "Occasionally that hunger and privation tend to beget a frame of mind impervious to the consolations of religion." So for them, there was a really fine balance between need, creating a space for them to encourage faith, and also need swamping any ability to be faithful. The very format of the letter, I think, provided many women with a space shaped by conformity that allowed for safer protest. By observing the dictates of the letter, addressing the Archbishop as "my Lord," for example, and ending with the valedictions of obedience and loyalty, such as "your obedient servant," these women could contain their resistance within the confines of formal loyalty. The combination of expressions of loyalty with threats of defection was vital to the nature of the type of protest that they could get away with. Without illustrations and declarations of allegiance and submission, threats lost their potency and represented too great a risk to the applicant. After all, the goal was to secure assistance, not an irreparable breach with the church. Nonetheless, the extent to which many women threatened defection or articulated protest remains really surprising and reveals their desperation, but also, I think, their assessment of their place within their church's mission. In effect, these women used their position as mothers to bargain with their church and sometimes to transform motherhood into a potential act of sabotage. In March 1932, Mrs. J.B. wrote as an embattled mother whose situation was being worsened by a lack of support from Catholic sources. Pardon me for writing to you these few lines. I would not, only for fighting for an honest living for my little hungry family, and I am continually turned down by Catholic sources. She complained that her family was kept down to die of starvation by our own Catholics, and made it clear that she had done everything within her control to feed her family. She rejected what must have been a common mantra among priests, that there were many worse cases than hers. I think you can almost hear her echo what she was probably told by the Vincent de Paul and other sources. Everything that I had in my place of birth sold and pawned to get my children food. We have not a bed to lie on, and only what is infected with bugs and dirt, and still one is told by their Catholic priests, there are people worse off than me. She pointed out that she had already had her case publicised in the newspaper by the campaigner Lady Miss Harrison, she refers to her as. And if it was not for this lady's great kindness, we would have been starved alive in our room, she told the Archbishop. And if nothing can be done by Catholic societies, I may be compelled to do something against my will. The Archbishop would most certainly have known that Miss Harrison, a well-known social campaigner and artist, was a member of the Church of Ireland. And therefore, the threat in going to her was quite implicit. But I also thought it was a very interesting example of using kind of wider publicity to put pressure on the church, the idea that there would be an article in the newspaper that might embarrass the church due to its lack of generosity. Mrs. J.B.'s parish priest reduced her rather damningly to an inveterate beggar, in the ordinary way, not deserving of help. But revealingly, he still believed it would be judicious move because to deprive her of the opportunity of saying that she had not been helped by the Archbishop would be a good thing. So although he raises serious questions over her credibility, he still feels the church should give her some assistance because he doesn't want her to have the capacity to say negative things about the church using her access to the newspaper. Sorry, this is actually the letter relevant to Mrs. B there, where she says, "Pardon me, but I'm writing to you as the mother of these Catholic souls." I should have moved the slide on, and I think this is the one from the priest here. So this is where he describes her. This woman is an inveterate beggar, and in the ordinary way, in no way deserving of help. And this is where he says also, however, I think it would be prudent nonetheless to give her help. And I was really struck by that because I read the work of Una Walsh, who looked at the Protestant Widows and Orphans Society, and she concluded that the threat had the exact opposite effect in the Protestant society. So when Protestant women threatened to go to Catholic sources, they were cut off by the society. And yet in the Archbishop's archive, it's exactly the opposite. You have to do it. You have to make the threat cleverly, but it is almost always successful, and even when not believed. And she gets £5 in this case, which, as I say, is quite a significant sum of money in comparison to the average of £1. And I think also this exchange reveals the church's sensitivity to such threats and a fear regarding adverse publicity, even when it was clearly felt that it was being played, as in this case. While the strategy of threatening defection seemed to have been effective for Catholic mothers when dealing with their church, we should not assume that it was a tactic deployed without reservation or regret, or that it was an idle threat either. Dinah Cole King recalls her mother, a devout Catholic, in 1930s Dublin, agonizing over whether to seek charity from non-Catholic sources. And she gives a really moving account of what it cost her mother to do that, because she actually held her faith very dear, but felt she had no choice but to use a religious market that was open to this kind of manipulation, that in fact encouraged it. She wrote, "I was maybe 9 at the time. We were very poor and I was sick, and really there was no food or anything. And we went to Vincent de Paul for help. But we had a clean home and they thought, if your house is clean, you're well off. So we went to the Salvation Army and they gave us help. And my mother was very upset. I remember, and she was crying." And I think that's a really moving reminder that this sort of use of this religious bargaining, if you like, may well have cost the people employing it quite dearly, as in the case of Dinah Cole King's mother. This form of protest could then also be interpreted as a reflection of the very hard choices women of faith had to make for the sake of food. And this is one of my favorite correspondence here. And again, it gives you a sense of the wide array of material which ordinary people used actually to even write to the church. This is actually written on the last page of a school copybook, where the paper is quite shiny. You're not supposed to write on it. And as you can see, it's written in crayon. When all else failed, women were capable of maintaining moral independence from the system by revealing their knowledge of how it really works. As Mrs. Penny C. here told the Archbishop in 1937, "I can see now that religion is only a cloak. What matters which side you're on once you've enough to eat?" And I remember the day I read that first in the archive, and it just floored me. It just floored me for its perception And it's lyricism. It's really beautiful, despite the fact that she clearly, has difficulty spelling and so on. She has absolutely no difficulty putting her finger on the moral mark, I think. When telling stories in order to explain one's need, it was perhaps unremarkable that men engaged in notions of masculinity that abounded culturally and socially, just as women had done so in relation to motherhood. In a society that was organized around the concept of patriarchal family with its male breadwinner, domestic wife, and obedient children, the loss of financial independence was particularly challenging for men's identity. That men characterize their feelings of failure in this regard as failings of masculinity isn't surprising. The father who couldn't provide was a cultural oxymoron. The fear of slipping into the abyss of poverty was often expressed in men's letters in terms of their own personal redundancy and their desire to keep it from their families. There's little doubt that begging or needing charity posed a more fundamental challenge to the cultural ideas of manhood than it did to notions of femininity. Women were expected to look beyond themselves for the financial support of their children. They could accommodate, if you like, the act of begging within an understanding of their appropriate role to protect and provide children, no matter what the personal cost. In fact, they were often praised for it. For men, however, the concept of providing bread went to the heart of their place in society, and to fail in this regard, to beg, was an anathema to men's role. This anxiety was compounded by the visceral fear that regaining one's footing once lost was incredibly difficult, and that their children's futures would be blighted as a result. And it's a mantra that's repeated over and over again, this idea in Ireland that if you slip, if you fall, your children will pay for it, and they'll pay for it for a generation, that there won't be a way back. Mr. PM, who wrote in 1922, when his health failed after his business collapsed, explained how unemployment could subvert gender roles and result in deep shame. I would not feel the pinch so badly, but when I think of my 3 little children, my wife is obliged to go out to business in order that we may exist and keep a roof over our heads. This indeed is a shame for me, yet I can assure your grace, I am quite helpless for want of employment. He points to another thing as well, which is the fallacy of the idea that married women didn't work outside the home, and they may not have worked in recognized professions or in recognized employment places, but they earn money, and they're the key financial players, particularly in the poorest communities in Ireland in the early 20th century, and have been really virtually eclipsed, I think. But few expressed this sense of emasculation as eloquently as Mr. Joseph MacN, who built and maintained a relationship with the Archbishop over 15 years between 1924 and 1930, during which time he received over various intervals £120, which is a huge sum of money. Although he deployed similar rhetorical devices to other writers, his ability to chronicle the impact of poverty on male identity remains palpable. His letters continue to be effective in inducing his reader to bat for him. Almost 100 years later, it's impossible not to hope his schemes will not work out, and he always had a new idea. Despair when they fail him, and wish you could turn time on its head and write the ending for Joseph MacN. You will understand, he wrote, how humiliating it is for a man to have to appeal or to admit he is down. My very manhood seems sapped and squeezed out of me, which I thought was a wonderful expression for how exhausting poverty can be. In 1938, Charles D. wrote for a little help that would put him in a position to support his family. He warned that if he did not receive assistance, the opportunity will pass and his family would be faced with a future, and I quote him, "What I hardly dare to think, separation from our children, and as I may leave this country, probably separation from my wife." Charles D.'s narrative impetus was the telling of decline, but his story was carved out of the depth of familial loyalty. He'd been a good son to a good father and sought to do the same for his own children. He displayed a keen sense of what the idealized roles of various family members represented, and he painted his own family as the perfect model for rescue. His wife was, and I quote him, "a very good Catholic, and consequently very patient and the best of wives to me, and mother to our children. I do not drink or gamble myself, and have not smoked since we got into difficulties. A little help towards putting us back and making a start again in our old home would probably be the turning point of our whole lives and that of our children. His wife was all she should have been to him and his children, and he was an ordinary man. Through his periods of unemployment, which he had documented meticulously in his letters, they had lived sparingly and watched their small savings evaporate and their furniture vanish, and only as a last resort applied for unemployment assistance. However, they had been reduced to an income of 14 shillings per week and a food ticket to the value of 5 shillings from the Conference of St. Vincent de Paul. Despite life's provocations, Charles D. and family, and I quote him, kept our troubles to ourselves in the hope of I being able to get work of some kind eventually. In other words, he had hoped to sort the problem out as the breadwinner and not to resort to asking for help. Charles D., like so many other men, felt stripped of his dignity by poverty, and he evoked this sense quite literally in his physical shabbiness. Unfortunately, I am not even well enough dressed to look for or take up a better class of position. He had been so emasculated that it was no longer in his power to exact his own rescue. No other reason would compel me to address this appeal to your grace, but the great need of my wife and little children, together with the natural desire to provide for and rear them in a home where they can enjoy the family ties of affection together and learn to help and stand by each other as we would wish to see them in their lives, to come true to their religion in the love of God as we are teaching them. This family unit validated not only Charles D.'s existence, but also his Catholicism. And I think he did a superb job of sort of bringing that picture together. The ways in which men and women who wrote to the Archbishop of Dublin engaged with the ideas of the appropriate behaviour for husbands, wives, fathers, mothers, and children provide an alternative reading of the patriarchal ideology and its negotiation. It may have been imposed from on high, but it was also claimed and redefined from below. In these letters, gender roles became part of a narrative of inequality and justice denied. There's little doubt that deep class convictions played a role in the way the poor were considered and helped, but there were also many other factors at play, some obvious, such as the role of faith and Catholicism, others less so, like prejudice, fear, and sexism. Mrs. C, that's actually, sorry, I forgot to go forward with this again. This is Joseph D.'s letter, the one who received £120 from the Archbishop over the course of the many letters he wrote. You can see his beautiful handwriting, and he wrote all of his letters on those long account book ledgers, you know, the ones with the red lines either side. So this is just one section of them, but he would fill pages, and they were often very repetitive, and they would go over and over and over the point at which he felt his story and his life had taken a wrong step. I've included the extract there, put my cursor under it, where he says, my very manhood seems sapped and squeezed out of me. And only for my youngsters, death would be a relief. In other words, you know, I'm so gone that I would die if it weren't for my children. I would consider death a relief if it weren't for the fact that I'm a father. And I end on my favorite author, who I cited up above in the paper, because it's her question that gave the title to this paper. When she wrote the year of the 1937 Constitution, which I'm sure she paid little enough heed to, asking the following question: is this a civilized country? For all the push and pull of charity, those who needed to engage with it and its inherent arbitrary nature were often more than capable of exposing the system for what it was, essentially manipulative and premised on an acceptance of inequality. Thank you very much. I will stop that, the PowerPoint now, stop sharing my screen. And if anybody has any questions, I would be delighted to answer them, or try to.
That's fabulous. Thanks, Lindsay. Are there any questions from anybody? You put them in the chat. Just give it a minute there.
Everybody's tired after a long day.
I'll just ask one of my own. I'm presuming that it was the same countrywide, so that, you know, all bishops would have had similar correspondence.
I assume they did as well, but they haven't collected them or kept them. So they're there in archives so Cara DeLay has used some of the ones in Cork and Cove and so, but they're much more scattered. They're not in the kind of, you know, discrete boxes that Byrne put them in. And the Archbishop before him, Walsh, didn't save them in the same way either, but McQuaid does. McQuaid gets even more, and he's kept them as well, and they really explodes under McQuaid. But yes, I think the history of people petitioning figures of power goes right back. So we know also that tenants also petitioned landlords in a very similar way, and there are hundreds and hundreds of similar letters. So there's a long history of this form of writing. It's really, really very interesting.
It's fascinating, and you know, the subtle threat, you
Yeah.
know, in so many of them, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, even when you can see that they're straining against the limits of their literal education, so the degree, but they have absolutely no problem in articulating in really pithy ways.
Yes.
Well, but when I first encountered the collection, I have to say I was stunned at the degree to which they were quite threatening and they were not. Some of them were obsequious, but that's by no means the majority. Many of them are, look, you know, this is tough and this is how it's going to be. And, you know, I was surprised at that. But in a sense, it fits in with that longer history of petitioning, where people really have to be willing to lay it on the line. And this is international as well. You see very similar material coming out of other countries, obviously Britain and Scotland, but also in other European countries as well. But there's one difference that I found in the Irish ones when I was comparing them to ones written in France and Germany, for example, and even in Britain, is the medical literacy of the Irish ones. So they will often know the title of illnesses that they have, and while they can't spell much, they can spell rheumatism, and they can spell whatever their disease is. And I think that has to do with the close association between a medical diagnosis and entitlement to poor relief, which comes together in Ireland in the 19th century. And I also think doctors were acting as advocates. So they were saying, look, here's your diagnosis, this is what you have. So when you're looking for relief, this is what you tell them you have, which is why it's the one thing that people, you know everything about and can spell. So I find that quite interesting.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Just one there. Sorry. Did your research show repeat pleading for assistance? And did many people ever or eventually leave Ireland? Or was that apparent?
Yeah. No, there was the Archbishop was quite it's very interesting, actually. That's a fantastic question. Yes, people wrote repeatedly, but the only people that were successful in having a sustained, relationship with the Archbishop were those in the middle classes. So anybody in the working class that wrote more than once was told, that's it, you've been helped. This is a one-off, this is a one-stop shop. And they were in an impossible situation because public assistance was given for around 3 months. Unemployment benefit would run out. The Vincent de Paul would only support you for a certain amount of time because they wanted you to be able to be sort of independent and self-sustaining after a certain period. And so all resources at some point ran out. But for those that wrote, so Joseph that I cited, for example, had worked in the civil service and would have been sort of lower middle class initially and then fell through, if you like, the social net. He sustained a relationship, and there's many women who did as well. So particularly widows from middle class backgrounds who were looking for assistance to pay for the secondary education of their children, they would get serious sums of money. And the other group that would get money over a sustained period would be, as they would have been known at the time, sort of spinsters that lived together. So families full of women who didn't marry and who would maybe have come upon hard time as they became older. There was a lot of sympathy for that. And there was quite a few women that were sustained over a long period of time, getting kind of 50 a year for several years. And the other example would be, and I think this is a really interesting one, would be people whose parents had left everything to the Archbishop in his will. And they would write and say, you've received 5,000, we're penniless, what are you going to give us? And he would then give them sums of money, possibly over a period of time, but nothing near what the church had received. And so that was kind of interesting. Also, whenever somebody would leave the Archbishop anything in their will, there'd be a kind of an uptake in letters, because people were clearly reading this in the newspaper. And that what was very interesting is that these people were clearly aware. The newspaper was clearly a real source of information as to when there might be money and when there would be an opportunity to write to the Archbishop at a time that they might be more, because they often cite having read something, or they'll say, oh, we read my Lord Archbishop, that you were in, you were visiting such and such an area, or that you blessed such and such a hospital. So they've been reading it in the newspaper clearly, and were tracking his movements and tried to kind of engage him in a personal relationship that way.
That's truly fascinating. I can't believe that people would leave money to the Archbishop and not to their own family, There's just one, maybe just two more, and we leave it at that. So this is from Paula Flanagan. She says, were women generally more successful in gaining support? I ask, as I'm curious about women's agency, perhaps through activism throughout this period, right up to the women's movement of the 1980s.
Yeah, very good question. Yes, on balance they were, and in fact you would have occasionally men writing saying, I know I don't have a chance. And now particularly there, but there was an understanding that there was a kind of hierarchy, and the people most likely to be successful would be women, who didn't have a breadwinner for whatever reason, with the exception of single mothers, but deserted wives, widows, and those whose husband were unemployed were the first in the pecking order in terms of getting something. And then married men who'd fallen on hard times would get something. But women were definitely, they were much better. They were just much better at it as well, much better at negotiating exactly what they needed. And they could really pitch their case very well. And most of the letters are from women. So I think, women, and there's one or two where I think they might be jointly written by husbands and wives, but that's relatively rare. So I would say on balance, yes, women were more successful, and also better at negotiating at that level.
Okay, and just the last one then, are you aware of any research which has been carried out in the North?
On similar collections?
Similar collections, yeah.
No.
Parity, yeah.
No, I'm not on similar type of collections, although they must. Well, actually, no, that's not true. Not in terms of religious, no, but in terms of similar letters, yes. Alwyn Purdue has worked on really interesting collections of letters written to the mayor in Belfast, and so there's similar collection, and they're very into. We've actually compared them, and so those letters tend to make similar pleas to king and country, and so in a way that the Catholic letters that I'd be looking at will make kind of gestures of loyalty or otherwise, or defection to the church. There's a very similar basis, but it's oriented towards the crown in those cases. And again, they tell a very similar story, particularly in relation to male unemployment, because her collection actually dates from the 1930s, so after the 29 crash, which of course hits Belfast, particularly badly. And so the articulation of male unemployment in her letters is really graphic, and that the idea of a loss of manhood, it's clearly something that, I'm starting to kind of look systematically at public writing in newspapers and so on about male unemployment in the 30s, because it's clearly a trope that is being played elsewhere, that men are suffering from an identity crisis, what we would call it now, in the 30s. It's framed, and it's that people are trying to explain abandonment of families, or the increase in alcoholism and various other things. So they're looking for reasons why families are breaking down. And there's similar, work being done in Britain at the same time, very similar anxieties about, well, men, when men can't get jobs, there's no incentive for them to stay around in a family. And there's a real fear, particularly in Ireland, the fear is that they're using seasonal migration to disappear. One of the questions asked me about emigration, that appears all the time, both because somebody has gone away and they're therefore alone without a breadwinner, or there are people who will be unsuccessful migrants asking to get help to come home. So there's one or two from Australia and very, you know, far places where it's really expensive and they need some kind of assistance to be repatriated. But emigration is all over the place, threaded through the letters, even inadvertently, as a kind of way of surviving, and particularly seasonal, the male coming backwards and forwards, and the women writing in the absence of their male breadwinners saying, you know, I need him back, you know, will you help me? That kind of thing.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I think we leave it at that. So thank you all very much for joining, and thank you so much, Lindsey.
Thank you. Yes, I hope I can do something similar when COVID allows us all to be in a room. That would be lovely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Good evening.
Thank you.